Thank you very much for the introduction, Thomas, and indeed for the invitation to take up this topic, which has interested me. Obviously, I come from Ireland, and this is one of the countries that has expressed opposition to the Mercosur agreement. Indeed, we have a new government in Ireland, and part of the programme for government is indeed to refuse to ratify the agreement. And largely, this is because of concerns over the impact on livestock farming, beef farming in particular. So that's really what I want to discuss with you in the next few minutes. So let me try and share the presentation. We did it a moment ago, so let's hope that it works now. Thomas, maybe you could just indicate, do you see that okay?
Perfect view.
Perfect.
Yeah, great. So let me just see if I can, how do I move this forward? Yeah. So I think we're all familiar with the fact that this agreement has been a contentious one. It has taken 25 years to finally get to an agreed political agreement around a text. The mandate was given to the Commission in 1999. It's a mixed agreement, which means that it has both a trade pillar, but also a political dialogue and a cooperation pillar. There was an agreement reached already in 2019, which I think it's fair to say met with at best a lukewarm reception. As a result, the Commission re-entered negotiations with the Mercosur countries in 2023, and that in turn then led to the political agreement that was reached in December of last year. But as I've just indicated, the ratification of the agreement remains very uncertain. We see shifting views in the European Parliament. A resolution passed in 2020, so that was the previous Parliament, basically rejected the 2019 text at the time, although subsequently there has been a more welcoming resolution passed in the Parliament saying ratification would be dependent on some side agreements, particularly around environmental issues. Nonetheless, at least 4 member states, France, Ireland, Poland, and indeed Austria, have indicated that they are unlikely to ratify. And indeed, there may be other countries that are vacillating and at the moment sitting on the fence. The precise legal basis for ratification remains to be decided. As I say, this is a mixed agreement. If it covers, as such, it will cover some items that are the prerogative of member states, which means that in principle, it requires agreement not just at the European level by Council and Parliament, but also ratification by each individual member state. And in the case of Belgium, of course, by the two federal entities there. So there is a question of whether the agreement might be taken in parts, so the trade agreement treated separately to the other 2 pillars. This all remains to be decided. The opposition is coming particularly from farm and environmental groups. As I say, it's based on income fears, particularly for those in the livestock sector, but also concerns around differences in standards and the risks associated with increased deforestation. Let me just move on. So just to remind you what the trade provisions of the agreement are, on the EU side, we have offered full liberalisation of EU imports of manufactured goods from Mercosur countries, and indeed full agricultural liberalisation apart from these various so-called sensitive products. In the case of beef, the offer is not full liberalisation, but 2 new reduced rate tariff rate quotas of the amounts specified here. which would be associated with a much lower in-quota tariff than the most favored nation, the MFN tariff that would usually apply to imports of beef. In addition, then the removal of a 20% in-quota duty on the Hilton beef tariff rate quota, which already exists, and I'll come to describe these quotas in a moment. For the poultry sector, two new tariff rate quotas for bone-in poultry and also for boneless poultry. There would be a duty-free tariff rate quota for sugar, but this would actually replace an existing tariff rate quota, which has an in-quota duty of 98 euro per ton. So it's effectively removing that in-quota duty rather than increasing the amount of the tariff rate quota per se. There are then other tariff rate quotas for ethanol, for pork, for orange juice, for corn and sorghum, and also for some dairy products, rice, honey, eggs, and so on. But basically, the focus in my talk, and indeed where most of the controversy has arisen, is around the quotas for beef and for poultry. So the two livestock quotas, and that's I'll focus mainly on beef, but I'll say something about poultry towards the end of the presentation. On the Mercosur side, again, there is nearly complete liberalization of manufactured goods. Some sensitive products remain with tariff preferences. For the agricultural sector, the duties are fully removed for these particular export products where there is already some exports, and the prospects, obviously, of increased exports if the current tariffs shown here are removed. And then for some dairy products, there are some zero duty quotas to the volume specified here that will be opened. There are some other issues that we need just to keep in mind. The EU has succeeded in getting protection of around 350 geographical indications. And this is an important element in our export profile. These tend to be sort of premium products with a high added value. There will be lower non-tariff barriers due to more streamlined procedures, including for measures that affect trade in agri-food products. And specifically regionalization in the case of animal disease outbreaks, so that, for example, if there's an outbreak of avian flu in Germany, there could be restrictions for a single country, but not necessarily for the EU as a whole. There's a bilateral safety net clause if increased imports cause or threaten to cause serious injury to a specific sector. And there's also disciplines on the use of export taxes. This is, of course, particularly something which has been a feature of Argentinian trade policy in the past. But this would refer to hides and skins, but other beef products are not affected. So, as I say, much of the opposition to ratification of the partnership agreement focuses on the impact of these beef tariff rate quotas. And I quote here from press releases from the Meat Industry Ireland Association, which represents the beef processing industry in Ireland, suggesting that the agreement will flood the EU with beef from South America. They cite their own estimates that the impact on beef production will be a drop in value of about 1.3 billion, which would represent around a 3.5% reduction on the 2024 value of cattle output. And they also highlight that the EU will lose out on tariff revenues, which of course go to finance the EU budget. However, understanding how tariff rate quotas lead to increased trade provides, in my view, a more moderate impact. I'm going to suggest that it might be around 2% rather than the 3.5% that the industry fears for beef producer revenues, just in a very simple setting. But I'm also going to present some very preliminary results from some joint work with Alexander Goha at INRAE in France, using a CGE model, suggesting that the income effects would even be much smaller than these figures might suggest. So just to spend a little bit of time understanding these beef tariff rate quotas, this is the transition, the phasing in of these quotas over in 6 steps over a 5-year period. And you can see that they're roughly balanced between a quota for fresh chilled beef and a quota for frozen beef. And that has some implications, which I will highlight in a moment. Just to kind of understand the economics of tariff rate quotas, and these are 2 diagrams from the work that Scully did back in 2001. And essentially, a tariff rate quota is characterized by 4 dimensions. So you have obviously the quota volume itself, you have the in-quota tariff, you have the out-of-quota tariff, which is the MFN tariff that would apply to third country imports generally. And then you have a method of tariff administration. And that's quite important in determining where the quota rents end up. Is it with the importing country or is it with the exporter? And you can have various settings in terms of the initial trade. So basically, the question is, which is the binding element of those different dimensions of a tariff rate quota? So the first diagram on the left there is a situation where demand, in fact, is even less than the tariff rate quota at the in-quota tariff rate. So basically, the exporting country isn't able to fill the tariff rate quota because there isn't sufficient demand. And it's clear that if you were to increase tariff rate quotas in that situation, you're not going to have any additional trade because, as I say, trade is not constrained by the quota volume. If you then turn to the panel on the right, which shows the situation where indeed the quota volume is the binding constraint. And in that case, if you were to increase the tariff rate quota volume, you would indeed see additional imports as a result. But the interesting case, as we'll see in a moment, is where you have already trade which is entering, imports which are entering at the MFN quota, at the MFN tariff rate. So you do have existing tariff rate quotas, but in addition, you have imports from Mercosur that actually pay the high MFN tariff. And here you can have 2 situations because we're going to provide additional quotas to the Mercosur countries. And you have 2 possible outcomes. One is where the additional quota would mean that the overall quota, so in other words, the existing quota plus the additional, is still less than the volume of imports that we currently import from these countries. And in that situation, again, you will not have any additional trade created. You'll have an additional quota rent, which, as I say, may accrue either to the importer or to the export, depending on how the quota is administered. But you will not have additional trade, not additional export volumes. The situation which we're going to come up against is the right-hand panel, where you offer an additional quota which actually exceeds the current volume of extra quota imports. So in that case, you will see additional trade, but not to the extent of the additional quota, because you have to subtract the existing volume of extra quota imports. Those will, in a sense, substitute. They will switch to the lower in-quota tariff. They will switch to become part of the tariff rate quota, but they will not be additional imports. It's only the difference between the additional tariff rate quota and the existing volume of extra quota imports, which leads to additional trade. So that's the sort of the theoretical background. Let's now look at some numbers. So here we have just a trend in beef imports from Mercosur countries. These are in carcass weight equivalents. Important to bear in mind that we need to make this conversion because clearly a ton of boneless beef is a different product to a ton of bone-in beef because essentially the carcass weights would be different. You can see that by and large there is some variability in the blue bar, but there isn't any evident upward trend. The figures for 2024 are only up to October, so that's the reason why they're somewhat less. When we get the full year figures, we'll probably see them, come up to, if you like, the trend line that you can see with your eye. Because the quotas only refer to fresh and frozen beef, I've shown these separately. And again, you can see the frozen beef, very stable imports. The fresh beef, you see some increase in the early part of the period, a sharp drop in the COVID years when, of course, the food service sector was closed in Europe. Essentially, restaurant demand fell away, and that's where a lot of the, particularly the fresh beef from Argentina would be sold. And you can see some slight recovery. Again, remember that the 2024 figure is not yet for the full year. But basically, I would see a fairly stable picture, no evidence of major trends in imports from those figures. The other thing to bear in mind is that these figures, which are taken from the DG Agri-Food data portal, are based on what Eurostat calls the statistical regime 4, which includes also imports from Mercosur countries under inward processing arrangements. So essentially, that beef would be re-exported out of the union. It would not be subject to tariffs coming in, but it would not be sold subsequently on the EU domestic market. So the figures are a little bit exaggerated in terms of the beef which is actually sold on the EU market as a result. If we look at the breakdown between the Mercosur exporters, we see a clear division of labor, if you like. So the breakdown here is between the four Mercosur countries. Bolivia has now joined, but is not an exporter of beef to the EU. So what you see is a clear distinction between fresh beef exports, which come largely from Argentina, a much smaller share from Brazil, and indeed Uruguay would be the second major exporter of fresh beef. But it's completely different when you look at the frozen beef exports. Here we see the dominance of Brazil, Argentina hardly contributing to that trade, Uruguay to a much smaller extent. And that distinction follows through in terms of the channels of distribution in Europe. So essentially, you see the fresh meat coming into Northern Europe. Germany, Netherlands, of course, Netherlands is in part reflects the entrepot nature of trade through Rotterdam, whereas the frozen beef goes largely to Southern Europe, particularly Italy, where it's generally made into processed beef products, sausages, bresaola, and other processed meats. So really rather different trade channels and with different impacts as a result for the EU beef market. Just a reminder that the MFN tariffs on beef exports are really extraordinarily high. It's hard to see just from the tariff rates themselves because they're a hybrid of an ad valorem and an absolute tariff. But if you relate those to the unit values of imports, and for the fresh beef, I've taken here the the boneless other cuts, which is the main product exported by Argentina. The MFN tariff is around 40% based on a 3-year average. But if you actually look at the boneless other cuts, and where Brazil is the major exporter, the MFN tariff ad valorem equivalent is close to 60%. So very high protection of the EU beef market. Where you do see trade, then it's important to note that these benefit from existing tariff rate quotas. And there are 3 which I want to highlight. There's a frozen beef quota, which was created under GATT many years ago. It's an erga omnes quota, which means that all third countries can apply to export under it. And it's administered then by DG Agri, allocating licenses to those who apply. The second quota is the Hilton high quality beef quota. I've referred to that already. This is a TRQ for fresh or frozen boneless beef, which for Mercosur countries must have been exclusively pasture fed since weaning. And currently there's an in-quota tariff rate of 20%, and the agreement would essentially remove that, and it would become a duty-free tariff rate quota. Here, these quotas are allocated specifically to individual countries, so we can actually see the use that each exporter makes of its quota. And you can see that by and large, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay fully utilize their quota, but this is not the case for Brazil. It only uses, on average, around 1/3 of its quota. And I put that down to the fact not that there is an in-quota tariff rate of 20%, but because much of the beef exported from Brazil to the European Union comes from feedlots, so they do not really have a system where they are finishing beef for the EU exclusively on pasture. So it's more a technical constraint rather than a tariff constraint. Finally, then there's the resolution of the hormones dispute, where quotas were opened for a specific number of exporters: US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and then 2 of the Mercosur countries, Argentina and Uruguay. And this is completely the opposite of the Hilton beef, because these animals indeed have to be finished on a concentrate diet for at least the last 3 months before slaughter. Now, what's interesting about this quota is that it was originally, of course, it was the US that objected to the hormones restriction introduced by the EU. But over the years, the US share of this quota was gradually falling. So in 2019, there was a renegotiation. An agreement was reached to reserve 35,000 tons. So the substantial majority of this quota will in future be reserved for the US. And this is going to reduce the size of this quota for, in particular, Argentina and Uruguay. And that's something to bear in mind when we look at the potential additional trade that might be created by the Mercosur agreement. Okay, so with these quotas, it's actually difficult, apart from the Hilton quota, to work out which exporters are actually making use of the frozen beef quota or the fresh beef quota. But fortunately, we have that data, and I have to thank Franz Sinabell for highlighting this for me. We do have this data from the DG Taxud, the Customs Directorate, and it's published on the DG Agri food data portal. So basically, what I've done here is for each of the 4 exporters, I've looked at their total exports of fresh and chilled beef, and how much of that then is coming in under one of the TRQs. And you can see that if you look at the bottom 2 rows, which gives you the totals, you can see that there is indeed a significant amount of out-of-quota imports from these countries. The TRQ amounts have stayed roughly constant, as you would expect. There's been no change in those quotas, but we see, in particular, Argentina being able to increase its out-of-quota exports, even at that 40% MFN tariff. So we do see significant trade in out-of-quota imports. And that is, if you recall the sort of theory of TRQs, we have to deduct that amount from the size of the additional quotas in order to assess the impact on additional trade. If we then look at the frozen beef imports, remember the MFN tariff here is much higher, 60%. And if you look at the last two rows again, you'll see that basically there is around 60,000 tons of frozen beef imports. Nearly all of that comes in through tariff rate quotas. Simply the MFN tariff is too high. So we don't really have any out-of-quota trade in frozen beef. So what I do then is I sort of make a back-of-the-envelope calculation. I would argue that the additional beef imports facilitated by the new TRQs are not the 99,000 tons, which is the overall size of the TRQs, but around half of that, around 50,000, and that's largely because of the existing overquota trade. I also argue that as these new quotas are phased in over the next 5 years, we do see new economic policies in Argentina. Basically, the removal of the export taxes on beef, which has been a feature of Argentinian policy for several years. So it is likely that Argentinian beef will become more competitive over time, and by 2030 we could envisage that, in fact, even more out of quota imports could come in from Argentina, even in the absence of the Mercosur agreement. Comparing that to the overall beef supply, it's an additional supply of around 0.74%. If we sort of take a price elasticity of demand and relate that to, if you like, the producer price rather than the retail price, then we can very simply calculate the estimated producer price change of around 2%. That's where my figure comes from. It's not that different from what the meat industry argues, but I think they are simply not taking into account this TRQ impact. I'm running out of time, Thomas, so let me just very quickly just give you a couple of slides on the extension that I've been working on with Alexandra Gohan, which is to run these numbers through a CGE model to get a sort of more accurate impact of the income impact of these changes. There are, of course, the official sustainability impact assessments, the most recent one being the LSE study in 2020. But in my view, they have major weaknesses. They don't simulate the actual agreement, but rather sort of an illustrative agreement. They don't model the TRQs accurately. And of course, they also use somewhat out-of-date data. So what we've done is basically to use the most recent GTAP data for 2017. We looked at two scenarios. One where we assumed full liberalization, including of all agricultural tariff lines. And then one with the actual offers, basically taking into account these TRQs rather than full liberalization. And the idea here was just to look at the impact that has in terms of defending, if you like, the livestock producers within the European Union. We look at a number of different settings, as you'll see in a moment. We don't do any baseline extension. We basically ask the question, what would the 2017 economy in the EU look like if the Mercosur agreement had been in place at that time? I haven't said anything about poultry so far, but I've done exactly the same calculations to look at the in quota and out of quota imports for poultry meat. And essentially, what we observe, it's the first two rows in this table. We observe that any poultry imports from Mercosur basically come in under existing TRQs. So there is very little out of quota trade. So that implies that if we offer an additional quota of 180,000 tons, basically that will create additional trade of that amount. And that's the shock that we apply. If we look at the full liberalization scenario, we're looking here at the impact on three sectors: on the cattle, that's the beef cattle producer sector; at the agri-food, which includes both primary and the food processing sector; and then the all is the economy as a whole. And I'm just going to refer to the EU figures here. So basically, if you just liberalize agricultural trade, agricultural food trade on its own, you get a sort of a negative shock on cattle farmers' incomes of just under 5%. If you look at the liberalization of manufacturing and also the reduction in the non-tariff measures that we've referred to, it's actually a little bit higher. So if we had a full liberalization, you would indeed see a major impact on cattle producers of around 5%. Of course, for the overall economy, you would see a positive gain. If you then do the scenario just with the agreement offers, so basically the TRQs, you see a dramatic reduction in the impact on cattle producers. You still see a negative figure, that's to be expected. If you do a standard CGE approach where you essentially assume full employment, we would estimate an income loss of about less than 0.5%. But if you actually assume that you actually have unemployment in the EU countries and you hold nominal wages constant and allow employment to vary, actually the cattle sector almost is indifferent. It would really have almost a zero effect. So the closure that you assume has quite an impact on the final impact. I'm running out of time, so I won't. I'll leave this for discussion. I have a comment on the argument that we should not ratify the agreement because of the differences in production standards. I also have a comment on the deforestation effects, but let me just come to my conclusions before I hand over to Franz. So, I mean, my basic argument is that EU livestock producers are indeed adversely impacted by the agreement, but by much less than what is commonly feared. And the expected hit to beef prices should be seen in the context of the recent upward volatility in beef prices. We've seen quite a significant rise, much more than the 2% drop that I have estimated earlier. There are, of course, clear macroeconomic and geopolitical benefits for the EU from ratification. We see those positive impacts in the CGE numbers. But of course, there's also a case for compensation if it turns out that potential losers actually become worse off while the agreement is implemented. So I would make compensation conditional. I would not say you're definitely going to lose and therefore you are entitled to compensation. It's only, to me, justified to give compensation if indeed we do observe a deterioration in incomes in the relevant sectors. Thomas, I'm going to hand back to you, and thank you for the attention, everybody.
Thank you very much, Alan. I hand over to Franz for a short comment. Please go ahead.
Sorry.
I'm just trying to close down Franz here, if I can just find my...
Everything's visible. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, for this presentation. I had the pleasure to read a draft version of the blog over the Christmas time, and I really was impressed how you used all the detailed information that is available in public domain right now to come up with an estimate that is far lower than what we have heard and seen so far. This is the state of play in 2020, so it's not the most recent one, but these figures are still in the head of many stakeholders, many policymakers, and they are the concern of farmers, and they are the fire of the opposition against this trade agreement. And therefore, I think it is very, very important to draw the attention to your study that uses much more recent information that was not available 2 or 3 years ago, and that is very detailed when we look at beef. It's not just beef, it's fresh, it's frozen, it's chilled, it's boneless, it's with bones. It comes from one country and another one, and all the details are necessary to evaluate the outcomes. I would like to turn to the political context. This is the agreement signed in December last year, and before that took place, there was a policy debate that was very heavy in 2020, and what policymakers said in 2020 is this trade agreement can only be saved if the corrections are substantial. And I think von der Leyen and her administration took this really serious and implemented many things that concerned people in 2020. I'd like now to turn to a few other publications and papers that deal with this topic. Of course, they are not so recent as yours, and they go back 20 years. I do not include the LSE study because everyone knows about it. Several people from around Europe worked on that topic, among them Janine Pelikan from Thünen Institute. At WIFO, we dealt with that topic as well. And what is different is that your analysis with Alexandre indicates a welfare loss for Mercosur Mercosur member states, while all the others indicate again. In the study I was involved in, we found out that the benefits per person are much higher in Europe than they are likely to be in the Mercosur countries. That's the context of your work. And now this is my last slide. How can we move on? Farmers seem to be still strictly opposing this agreement, and environmental NGOs are very reluctant to stop opposition. That's my impression. And other interest groups are relatively calm about the benefits they're expecting. And what does the Commission do, or did the Commission do? Well, between 2020 and now, it launched many regulations that are addressing concerns of environmental groups. You mentioned that there were deforestation regulation, but we also have the CSDDD. This sounds like a pesticide, and some trade economists think it has the same effect on trade. And the Commission ventilates considerations about a compensation for those who are affected, and this is where your talk ended. I think we have good instruments, we have good information in case we enter this agreement. It will be relatively straightforward to identify those that have losses due to the agreement. Of course, we are happy when there are people who have benefits. There will be many of them, also among agriculture, as your data showed. This is my discussion, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Franz. Ellen, do you want some time for a short reply, or shall we?
No, I think I took
collect
enough
questions.
time. Thanks, Franz, for those comments, and I can only endorse really what you have said. So I'm very happy to open it up to the participants.
Thank you very much. So I invite everyone to use the lift my hand button to signal to me that the comment is on the way. So please, Anna, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Alan, for being with us. Great presentation, very interesting. I was wondering, because you conducted a CEG model for the entire EU. So I was wondering whether you can venture something, I guess, about the regionalization of those impacts, because beef production is not equal to beef production. So how would this loss in the cattle sector be distributed across the EU? And I think, so did the preference heterogeneity that you used, was that for the entire EU, or was that also country specific? Because I would imagine that there might be some differences. So those would be my questions. Thank you.
Great. Thomas, if I can come back immediately on that, because it's a very obvious and good question, Anna. And indeed, we did break down the EU. There are some country-specific results. I didn't present them here due to pressure of time. But basically, what we find is bigger impacts on some of the Northern European countries. So Germany stood out. And then countries that supply Germany, so that Poland, for example, would be indirectly affected as a result, not because it's a direct importer from Mercosur, but because Germany is an important export market. Surprisingly, we found France to be relatively little affected, even though there is already some imports of Mercosur beef into France. But yeah, the numbers weren't as big as in Germany. I have to admit, Anna, we didn't separate out Austria, so I can't say anything about the Austrian situation. But there are some other country breakdowns as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Mrs. Rudloff. Please go ahead.
Yes. Hello. I hope you can hear me fine. Bettina Rudloff from the German Institute of International and Security Affairs. I had the pleasure many times already to discuss with Alan, and in a small team as well, we did a kind of impact assessment for the European Parliament on the EU-Mercosur agreement. But my question now is more on, Alan, you said in the very last slide, you could see some, some reasons for possible compensation. And now we enter the very political part, of course. So my question is, there are two, entry points foreseen for compensation or for protection. The first one you mentioned, which is safeguards. And it's always stressed so much recently that is specifically in this agreement, the new rule is that for the first time ever, safeguards are linked to TRQs. And my question was, I was a bit irritated about this stressing. The new commissioner as well is doing so. So, and how would that look like in case one uses these safeguards? That would mean the tariffs within the quota are raised again, or how could one consider these obviously new type of safeguard? And the second question, which is stressed very much as well in the political debate, is there's foreseen a kind of compensation fund of about 1 billion. And that actually is not much more than what you calculated as possible loss for beef farmers, right? 700 something. So I'm just thinking loudly about what could that mean in principle if this link would be done politically, saying, we have this compensation fund, and that could be enough for this loss you calculate. Thank you.
Thanks, Bettina. My concern about this compensation fund is that we don't fall into the trap we fell into with the 1992 cap reform. You might remember that was the McSharry cap reform, where we lowered intervention prices and we introduced direct payments to compensate for the envisaged loss of income that farmers would receive. That was in 1992. I think the reform was implemented from 1994 onwards. World prices actually rose quite significantly. There was no loss of farm income as a result of the change in the intervention prices, and yet we still introduced so-called compensatory direct payments to compensate for an income loss which didn't occur. And I would be concerned that if we simply say there's a 1 billion euro fund, if there's no real need to call upon that. I mean, we've seen quite a dramatic increase in beef prices over the last 24 months. Now, there's volatility there, and that may not stay, but there are maybe some reasons why we might expect that to remain the case. So my own view is that we should any sort of safeguard or compensation mechanism should be conditional, that there should be a real income problem observable if we are to implement or to trigger these. That will be the first point. Now, on the second point, how the safeguards might work, I have to admit I'm going to rely. You're the expert here. This is not something I have thought about. I had been more thinking about the compensation option. So yeah, thanks for raising this point. I think it's really interesting to think about it, but not something that I'm going to be able to contribute to. Yeah.
Thank you, Mrs. Döbeling, please.
Yes, thank you for your very interesting presentation. So my question would be, after you did that back on the envelope calculation on the amounts that would enter via the quotas, did you then take basically the out-of-quota tariff rates for those commodities where you assumed they would be still overfilled, and that's how you modeled it? Or did you endogenize the price by setting the quantities as exogenous to those levels that you calculated?
Yeah. Okay. There's two issues. One is the back of the envelope calculation, if you like, and then the other is the shock in the CGE simulation. So the shock in the CGE simulation is done exactly as you suggest. So we don't. You just have these aggregate product groups in the GTAP database. And we do this sort of out-of-model calculation to work out what the additional imports we think will arise, and then we impose that shock on the model. So price becomes endogenous, if you like. The actual size of the shock then is calculated, as I say. I mean, there is some uncertainty around it, of course, because essentially what you're trying to do is to compare the size of the quotas. We know what they are. The two quotas amounting to 99,000 tons, but we need to compare those to what the out-of-quota tariff, what the out-of-quota imports might be in 2030. assuming that the agreement was ratified during this year and that it was implemented from 2025, because the tariff rate quotas are phased in over 5 years. So it is trying to, if you like, identify what might be the out-of-quota imports. And we do see an upward trend over the last 5 years. We do see Argentina becoming more competitive in the exports of fresh beef in particular. I would envisage that will continue because of the removal of the export taxes on beef in Argentina. It depends, of course, also on how their exchange rate moves, and that's very unclear at the moment. But I think there's, I would see strong reasons why we would expect Argentina to become more competitive as a beef exporter over time. Brazil is a different situation. Brazil, as I say, really is only an exporter of frozen beef. It's sort of a different market in the EU, and there will be additional imports of frozen beef because, as I say, we have very little over-quota imports of frozen beef at the present time. So I have assumed that basically all of that increase that we will observe is really going to come in frozen beef. And that's important because the argument of the industry in Europe has been that we're going to see a flood of very high quality beef cuts, so fillet steaks and so on. And that's the premium market for EU beef producers. So there's a fear that the impact of those imports it will be more than simply the volume, that it is also a high quality product. But my argument is that that's not going to be the case. It's essentially going to be frozen beef, which is used essentially as an input or an ingredient into processed beef products. So it's not your premium steak market that will be largely impacted, in my view.
Thank you, Alan. Mr. Turner, please. You have to switch on your micro.
I'm so sorry. Now is it working? I hope so.
Working perfect. Thank you.
Andreas Turner from the Austrian Chamber of Agriculture. Thank you very much, Alan, for the presentation. I have a question regarding this over-quota trade. And well, your argument is that about 50% of this additional granted quota in the agreement will actually be shifted towards in-quota trade afterwards. What about the price? You mentioned that there's a very high tariff on beef, 60%, 40%, depending on the quality. So it's roughly €3 per kilogram, I think, plus 12% currently. So for the other 50% of the volume, or the other roughly 50,000 tons, but we have to expect that this volume will enter the European market at a very much lower price then. Is this also included in your calculation, in your model? Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Andreas. Essentially, the question you're raising is what happens to this so-called quota rent. So if you look at my diagrams, you'll see that there is a difference between, if you like, the landed price, the imported price, and the potentially a difference between the imported price and the market price. Now, in practice, whether you would observe that difference, so you're suggesting that indeed the imports would come in at the opportunity cost, if you like, to the Mercosur exporters, which is much lower. But that really depends on how the tariff rate quota is administered. And because it is going to be divided between 4 Mercosur countries, my understanding is that essentially the licenses will be issued by the relevant authorities in these countries. So they will control the export of beef. And in that case, there's absolutely the Argentinians know that they can get a very good price for their beef in the European market because they can sell at the with quota, the with MFN price, the with MFN tariff at the moment. So why would they suddenly, because they get this additional TRQ, why would they decide to drop their price and to take a much lower price? It's simply not going to happen. They will continue to demand the premium price that they can get for their fresh meat at the moment, and that will become a quota rent to the exporter. So I don't see it as reducing the EU market price. That just doesn't seem to me to be sensible business behavior. They know the price that they can get, and they will demand it. But it will mean a transfer of the quota rent to the Mercosur exporters. And that will be a loss in terms of tariff revenue to the EU. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Pelikan, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alan, for the presentation. And good to see you here. So, yeah, I have a question regarding the free trade scenario, because I think it's very interesting since we do calculation on the Mercosur agreement for a very long time. And in the beginning, we had huge negative impacts if we do a full trade liberalization, also on farm income and production in the beef sector. And then I think in the last scenarios we did 5 years ago, it was a bit smaller, this impact, because a lot of other liberalization had already occurred in the world for the EU. And so now I think in your presentation, in your study, which is much newer than the earlier studies that were already shown here, you get very low income effect for Mercosur country, for the EU farmers if we do a full trade liberalization. So I think it's very interesting, because maybe it's because we have already liberalized a lot to other countries, or what also would be interesting to see the tariff rates you have used in your CGE analysis, the initial database, because they are quite high, I think 40 to 60%, and some databases, because of if the quota is not full, they use a low tariff rate instead, and then you start from the very low tariff rate, which is not the real use tariff rate. So this is sometimes a mistake, not a mistake, but it's kind of implicit in some databases, in some years where the quota is not filled, that you use inside quota instead of outside quota, and then the liberalization has not that huge impact. So I think it's a really interesting point that your liberalization is so small in your study. And
yeah. May I add to this? I was wondering whether the long transition period that is used for reaching the full quota, this 5 years period, whether this plays a role for your small effect. Do you compare the steady state of the CGE solution to the non-liberalization regime, or do you use the full period with all the years of transition with lower quotas that certainly have smaller effect on farm income? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take your question first, Thomas. So no, I mean, it's not a dynamic model. It's a purely comparative static. So it is the steady state. The ultimate, the assumption is that you have reached the ultimate implementation of the tariff rate quotas, and then you compare what the 2017 economy in the EU would look like if you had that additional imports coming in. So it's purely a comparative static comparison. Janine's comment is a very interesting one. I mean, you're basically arguing that the effects seem to be much smaller than earlier studies. And this is something we need to look at. I mean, I was a bit reluctant to include those tables because, to be quite honest, we just have got them since the weekend. So it's not something we've been able to fully interrogate as yet. you're very well aware, of course, that the size of these impacts in CGE models depend critically on the size of the Armington elasticities that you use. I mean, we've used the standard GTAP ones. We have done a robustness check by doubling the elasticities, and of course, you do get larger impacts if you do that. So that would be one thing to compare with some of the earlier studies. You are absolutely right that there are significant differences in the tariff levels between the GTAP 2017 database, that's the most recent one, and the one that, for example, the LSE study would have used. I can't quite remember whether it was 2011 or exactly which one, but anyway, it was a considerably earlier one. And indeed, in the paper, we rerun our model with the tariff levels that were used by the LSE study. And interestingly, if we do that, we then get the same results as they do that both the EU and the Mercosur countries have a net gain, whereas with the 2017 tariffs, we observe this, somewhat counterintuitive result that it seems that the Mercosur countries could actually lose out as a result of the agreement. I'm not prepared to make that conclusion yet because I need to interrogate the numbers a little bit more. It may be that we haven't perhaps fully modeled all of the benefits. We haven't looked at the ethanol, for example, and one or two of the other tariff rate quotas that I highlighted earlier. We've also assumed in those runs that the quota rents, which I've talked about with Andreas, that they accrue to the importer, whereas I actually think they will accrue to the exporter. So that would also alter the numbers a little bit. So there's a little bit of fine tuning to be done, Janine, and I think your comment is very helpful in pointing us to something that we would need to just look at. Yeah. So thanks a lot for that.
Thank you. Mrs. Döbeling again, please.
Yeah, thank you for your first answer already. Just a backup question on that one. When you had your indigenized tariff levels at this point, did you check that this tariff level did not go beyond the out of quota tariff rate? So that the model result really does not indicate that the quotas could be overfilled?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I would probably need Alex here to give you a definitive answer, so maybe we can follow up with you later. But my understanding is that we apply the shock to the quantities. So we can't import more than what we expect to be imported with those new quantities. And in a sense, the tariff rate then is set out of action, if you like. It becomes redundant because it's not the binding constraint on the level of imports. But I would need to check. Yeah.
Okay, so you endogenized the prices rather than the tariff rates. Okay, that also makes sense, but that would still imply that one would have to know if the markup on the price is then higher than the out of quota tariff rate.
Yeah.
Because by the assumptions by Sully, that should just at that point flat out.
Yeah. Okay. Something to look at. Yeah. I can't give you a direct answer just now. Yeah. But
sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe a final question from my side. I would be interested if you expect some response on the side of the agricultural industry with respect to product differentiation, because usually you try to get this way out of competition. You make a product differentiation, labeling of meat in regional terms or whatever. Do you expect to happen something in this respect, or do you think there is no chance against Argentinian quality?
Yeah, I mean, I do find it interesting that there is this argument that the beef that we import from the Mercosur countries is somehow of low quality and the standards are lower. And yet, when I visited capital cities around in Europe, the one sort of branded steak houses that I observe are the Argentinian ones. I don't see, French beef steak houses or Irish beef steak houses, even though it's clear that customers do put most store on their nationally produced beef, no matter where they come from. But I mean, there is the well-known quality upgrading effect of tariff rate quotas. So when you do open a tariff rate quota, it obviously is most benefit to the exporter to utilize that for the most high value products. We saw that, for example, with the voluntary export restraints, which the EU introduced on imports of Japanese automobiles at one stage, I think in the 1980s. And the Japanese said, okay, we have a quota, so we're going to export our best cars to you because that's how we make the best use of the quota. And as a result, Japanese cars in Europe got a fantastic reputation for quality. And when the VRE, the voluntary export restraints were removed, that reputation was maintained. So kind of, you could argue it backfired. And you could see the same effect applying with the beef quotas. We're really encouraging the Mercosur countries to send us our the best quality beef, because that's the way they maximize the returns from the quota, and that in a sense is presumably going to enhance the reputation of that beef in the European market.
Okay.
It's not a direct answer to your question, Thomas, but a comment. Yeah.
Thank you. I have no more questions on the list. So thank you very much, Ellen, for the interesting presentation, and all the participants for their comments. I want to end with a tip for next week's seminar. It will be Mario Liebensteiner presenting ideas about almost fare-free mobility. And it's a talk about the effect of climate tickets on mobility and infrastructure investments. So thank you very much to everyone, and have a nice afternoon. Goodbye.